Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be the first video that's going up since my last holiday vlog. So I just wanted to give you guys the update. You know, last one I told you I had COVID. I am totally fine now. Well, kind of sort of totally fine. My isolation is ended. I'm out in the world again. I still do have a little bit of a lingering cough and congestion, but also to be fair, I've had sinus issues like before I got COVID, so I'm not really surprised that's kind of lingering. But yeah, otherwise I'm doing fine. Today's video is going to be my top 10 books of 2021. I even got my reading mug. I'd rather be reading. Actually, this is my mom's mug. I gave it to her for Christmas one year. But I thought it was only appropriate for today's video. Two things before we get into it. If you want to see more book content, I've ranked all of the books that I read in 2021 on my blog. I read 36 books this year, technically actually 37, but it's the first book in a series, so I'm just gonna count that for next year. And also, before we get into it, I want to say that I rank series together. That's because in my mind, I'm not going to recommend like the third book in a series. No one's going to just read the third book in a series. People read series together. So that's why I rate series all together, because I do think that all of the books kind of play an integral part. If the beginning of the series is really good but the ending sucks, that's obviously going to affect my rating type of thing. So I do rate them together, so you'll see in my ranking and also in this. You'll see here that I'm talking about my top 10, but there's more than 10 books here. So anyways, it's long and rambly. Let's get into it. Where I made a mess. I had all my books in order and then I took a thumbnail and now they're out of order. Starting with number 10, we're gonna start from the bottom and work our way to number 1. Number 10, I have The Seven Husbands of Evelyn, Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I read this back in July and I gave it 4 stars. So if you don't know about this book, because this book is pretty popular online, this story follows Monique. She is a journalist, I believe, or works on a magazine, can't remember which one. Anyways, she gets to do this story on Evelyn Hugo, who is this super famous old Hollywood woman. She's now like old. I can't remember how she is, maybe 80s or something like that. And Evelyn is famous because she had 7 husbands throughout her life, and Monique is kind of tasked in figuring out like who her true love actually is / was. And Monique, along the way, she kind of finds out that she's tied, her life is tied to Evelyn, even though she's never met Evelyn before. So I found the beginning to be a little bit slow because it's told from Monique's point of view. It kind of flip-flops back and forth in between the two of them, but in the beginning it's Monique's, and I found that a little slow and it takes a while to actually get into Evelyn's life. I found her first husband or two kind of boring, so it takes a little bit to get into the book. That being said, I really do like Evelyn as a character in the sense that she's a very complicated person. I don't love her and I don't hate her. There's like a lot of good and bad qualities about her, which I think is a sign of a really good book, you know, a very complicated character. I'm not a huge fan of who the love interest is. I'm not going to say it to not spoil the novel. Don't really like the person, but I will say that I appreciate their romance. That sometimes happens with me. Sometimes, you know, you don't like the love interest or like the main character, but you can still appreciate it. Overall, I enjoyed this novel and that's why it's in my top 10, but it didn't wow me as much as I anticipated since there was so much hype online. That's why it's only at number 10. Okay, up next. The writing is upside down. Whatever, I don't feel like flipping it over. Next, I have the Court and Roses series. This is by Sarah J. Maas, and as you can see, there is 5 books in the series so far. It isn't complete. Yeah, maybe my opinion will change as I read more books in this series. I read this from July to October, and I read in each of the books individually and then averaged them. So I think the average is like 4.3 or something like that. The best I gave a book was 4.5 and the worst was 3.5. So yeah, that was one of my biggest issues with this series, is that it wasn't very consistent. The books that I loved, I like really loved, but then there were some books I just didn't really like. This series, I should tell you what it's about. This series is about Feyre, who is a human and she must like serve her punishment for a crime that she committed by living in the fairylands, and she's living with like a High Lord fairy guy. And then the later books are also from the point of view of Feyre's sister Nesta. This is a character-based series, which basically means that it really follows the life and like personal growth of Feyre and Nesta. So it means that like not a lot of stuff actually happens plot-wise, which is like kind of why it's like a little lower for me. I think the world is incredibly cool, and while I do enjoy like the romance and stuff, I just wish that the plot was developed a little bit more. I found myself comparing this to Sarah J. Maas's other series, Throne of Glass, and I like that one way more. I'll link down my review of this book series because I do like an in-depth comparison about Throne of Glass and Courts of Thorns and Roses. But if you love fantasy, like you have to read this, especially if you're like a little older, like maybe in your like late teens, early 20s, and you're kind of looking for something to transition from YA to adult fantasy. I think this one is a good pick. Okay, up next we have the Shadow and Bone series. As you can see, I got the very nice box set for Christmas last year. And I just want to know if you know anything about Shadow and Bone. There are 2 spin-off series, and I rated those individually, like not together with Shadow and Bone, because they're kind of like their own series. So in my brain they're separate, even though I said that I rate series together. Anyways, so like I said, I got this set for Christmas last year. I read them in January, and I gave each of the books 4 stars. I think this is a really good introduction into the whole entire Grishaverse. Like I said, there's this trilogy and then 2 standalone duologies, so I think it does a really good job of like getting people into that whole entire world. Oh, I should tell you what the book is about. This book is about Alina, who is just kind of like a lowly map maker in this magical world, but then it turns out that she actually has this amazing power. She has a power to control light, and this really sparks the interest of the royals. And in this world there's like regular people, and then there's people who control powers, and they're like called the Grisha. So this sparks the interest of the royal family and the Grisha, and the commander, who's called the Darkling, who I think he can guess he can control darkness. He really takes an interest in Alina. So that's kind of like the premise of this book, and then it goes from there. I will say that obviously with a lot of fantasy books, it can be a little confusing. This one is huge and vast and wide, so it definitely takes a little bit to get into it. But I will say that Bardugo is pretty good, that she has like a key in the front of all the pages that like explain it to you, along with amazing maps as well. So it's always easy to like refer back to it. And I find that in the first series she's really good at like explaining things over and over again for people to kind of like really get into the world. That being said, Mal and Alina are my favorite characters in all of the Grishaverse books. That's why that this book is like a little like lower. That's why it's only at number 8. But I do think that this series is like a really good starting for the rest of the books in the world. So I do definitely recommend it, so that way you can read the other books in like the spin-off series. And also they did make it into a Netflix TV show, and I think it's helpful to have read the books before watching the show, but I think that with like most books and TV shows and movies anyways. So yes, if you want a good fantasy, definitely recommend the series. This is YA, so it, you know, the romance is a little like lighter and more innocent, but despite it being YA, I think it's really well built and well done. Okay, up next we have another series. This is the Outlands Pentalogy, and here are the books. I did put them in order and facing the right way this time. The first book is A Touch of Death, and by the way, the covers have been updated, so I have the old cover, the first one, but the rest kind of look like this. These books are by Rebecca Crunden, and Rebecca was kind enough to send me the first book, but I purchased the rest of the books in the series, so I kind of think that shows that I like the series. I read this from March to May, and I rated, it took me a while to read the series because I would read a book and then order the next book and then read it and then have to wait and order the next book. and there was some like shipping delays in between the books and stuff, and I like read all the books in between the books. Long way to say that like even though it took me a while to read the series, actually reading the books didn't take me long because as you can see they're pretty small. I rated all of the books differently. I will say the first 3 books in the series are the strongest. They're my favorite, but the 4th one is kind of like my least favorite. The last one I think does a good job at least of like wrapping up the whole entire series, so I do think it's worth reading all of them, but just want to note that the 4th one wasn't my favorite as much. The 3rd one's actually my favorite, so might be good to explain it, which by the way, the description of the first book and the actual plot I find are a little different, so just keep in mind this first book follows Kitty and Nate, and then in the later books there's another primary main character that gets introduced. But anyways, the first book is about Kitty and Nate. They live in this dystopian world and they get infected with this mysterious illness and they need to leave their like posh plushy life in the capital and need to escape to like the wilderness, like outside the country's walls. As you can guess, this is a dystopian. I would say this is kind of like in between a YA and an adult, like a new adult type of level. So the reason why I like the first 3 better than the last 2 is that I find that the first 3 are much more plot based. There's a lot of action, and the 3rd book like a lot of things happen. They're like going on like grand adventures and stuff, which I really enjoy. The last 2 books are a little bit more character based. Not as much stuff is happening per se plot wise. It's a lot more about character growth, which as you can tell from ACOTAR, it's not my favorite thing to read as much, but I really do like this series. If you like dystopian books but kind of find, okay, like Hunger Games and Divergent, those were some of my favorite books when I was a teenager, and just nothing compares to it. Everything is just trying to be a copycat of those 2 things. If you want something that's unique and stands up on its own but still gives you some of those like great elements of the other 2, this is a series for you. There's a lot of like philosophy in this series, but also a lot of action as well, and I just really enjoyed it. Like I said, they're like really small novels, so you kind of breeze through them quickly. The chapters are very long, which I find kind of addictive because you kind of just like keep on reading. I don't know if anyone else is like this, but I'm kind of the type of reader that I'm like, okay, I'll like finish the chapter before I go to bed. So because the chapters are so long, I read a lot. I just get through it quicker. It's pretty fast paced. So yeah, and it's an indie book. So if you read the series, you're kind of supporting the author directly. When I found out this was an indie book, I definitely had my hesitations, but I think this proved to me that indie books, there's some pretty good ones out there if this is what indie books are like. So yeah, that's number 7. Okay, number 6 we have A King of Scars. This is the 2nd duology spin-off from Shadow and Bone. So there's like the Shadow and Bone, then there was another spin-off series. This was the newest one. Actually, the sequel has come out to this. I have not read it yet because it is currently in hardcover, and all of my books in the Shadow and Bone series are in paperback, so I'm waiting for the paperback to be able to match it. So obviously my feelings might change after I read the 2nd book, and like, but I've read this book, so obviously I'm gonna rate it. I give it a 4.5 out of 5 stars, so that's why it's sitting at number 6. I read this back in February. I'm not going to say too much about the plot because it involves characters from the past 2 series, so I don't want to spoil it, but that's kind of what makes this book so great, is that like there's something about like going back and like reading about characters from like some of your favorite stories, because it's like going back home in a sense, you know what I mean? Like going back to like the people that you know. So that was really fun, but while it's about people that have already existed in the series, I think Bardugo takes the world and the people and then just brings it a whole entire new level, which is what makes it so great. I just love the characters in this book. I loved the direction that it went. Yeah, overall I'm really impressed that Bardugo was able to add another layer to her world. I'm excited to read the 2nd book. I heard a lot of people cried, so we'll see how I feel. But yes, I definitely recommend this, and I like this more than Shadow and Bone. Okay, now we're breaking into the top 5, and all of the books in the top 5 I all rated 5 stars. Kind of funny how it worked out that way, that like I had 5-star reads, and they're obviously all in my top 5. So kicking things off, we have Beauty Queens by Libby Bray. I read this book back in June. This book is like, I describe it as silly, stupid fun. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. This is a YA satire, and obviously with satires and comedy, it's subjective. Not everyone's gonna like it. This personally is right up my alley. So this book is about a bunch of beauty queens that get stranded on what they think is a deserted island, and kind of all the trials and tribulations that they go through. It's very wacky, and it's kind of reminiscent of Phineas and Ferb for me, because that show is just like completely unbelievable. Like the stuff that happens to that, it like probably would never happen in the real world, but it could. There is just that like slight hair of technically plausibility, but like honestly, instead of like sitting and questioning and being like, oh, that will never happen in real life, it's just easier just to go along with it and have fun, and that's what makes this book so fun. There's also like a lot of like references to late 2000s, early 2010. Well, I think it came out in 2010. So like late 2000s pop culture, I absolutely love, because I grew up during that time. Like I know about that time, and as someone who's like studied media and like pop culture and all that stuff, like I got all of the references, and it was funny. Like I love the way that it poked fun at all of that stuff. I also love the representation in this novel. There's a Black and an Indian character who talk about what it's like to be a person of color in the beauty pageant world. There's also disability representation. There's someone who's deaf in this book, and there's also a trans character in this book, and there's also lesbian characters and a lesbian romance, along with like heterosexual romance in this novel. So it's like great to see all this representation, also talking about it like in a beauty pageant type of setting. And also this, like I said, this book came out in 2010, so it's great to see that representation from an older book. I know this book isn't going to be for everyone, but if it sounds like it's your cup of tea, then you probably would enjoy it. I've read like a couple of stuff from Libby Bray, and so far I've loved everything, so she's definitely an author that I want to read more of in the future. Okay, the next books, I don't have the physical copies because I read them on my iPad through the Kindle app, and like even though I enjoy them, I don't feel like getting the physical copies. I don't even know if there's physical copies. Anyways, it is the Planet Barbarians series. If you're really like with it and like follow book communities online, then you definitely know what book series I'm talking about. If you haven't, then you're probably like, huh, what's so special about this series? I'll get into it in a second. I read these books in June. I gave the first book, there's like a ton of books in the series. I only read the first 3, and after that I was like, okay, this is enough, but I really enjoyed them. I gave the first one 4.5 out of 5 stars, and then the second 2 5 stars. I just decided to give it 5 stars overall because I had so much fun with it. So this series is an adult smutty romance sci-fi series. It's basically about this group of women who get abducted by aliens, and then they end up on this like frozen ice planet, and they're these like men aliens who are like huge. I think they're like 8 feet tall or something like that, and they're blue, and they have horns, and they're like ribbed and like large. I think you can use your imagination because it's a romance novel. Yeah, I think you know where I'm going. This is my first time reading like a real like romance novel. Like I've read YA romances, but never like adult, and I've read like fantasy books that have like some like smutty romance, but never like just a pure romance novel that has smut in it, and it was so much fun. I had so much fun. Listen, I think there's just, in the same way that there's different types of TV shows and movies that like hit, that have different goals and like for different reasons, it's the same thing with books. Like with movies, you have your like action movies, and you have your like Oscar level artistic movies, and you have your like documentaries, but then you have kind of like your like chick flick rom-com movies, or in the same way that with like TV you have your like reality TV show. I feel like romance novels are kind of the same way versus like other novels that like the goal of romance novels for me personally is just to have fun. And if I have fun reading the book, then that is a good romance novel to me. They don't have all the same purpose, but like one is not better than the other, because a romance novel or like a chick flick isn't necessarily trying to be this very like artistic, revolutionary, thought-provoking piece. It's just supposed to be like fun, and sometimes that's what I want when I read. I just want to have fun and escape, and for that reason I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars because I had fun and I enjoyed reading the book. I will say though that the sci-fi, a little far-fetched, not necessarily the most well done. If you're looking for a good sci-fi novel, this is not it, but I was able to put that aside because romance was so good. So going a little bit in the opposite direction, we have The Invisible Life of Addie, LaRue by V.E. Schwab. You know how I said there's like fun books and then there's like serious books? This is kind of one of those serious books. I give this 5 out of 5 stars. I read this back in May/June, like mainly June, and this is a beautiful, heartbreaking story. This is like, it's really hard because this book kind of like really broke me in a lot of ways, and I didn't necessarily like enjoy reading it, but it was like such a well crafted story that it deserves the high rating. And it didn't set out to be a happy book. It did what it was supposed to do. The plot of this is about Addie, who makes a deal with the devil that she lives forever, but the catch is that no one remembers her except for until one day she meets someone who does, and then the story goes from there. I think this is technically like new adult, like Addie is like stuck at 22 or 23 or something like that, and it's kind of nice because it's got little sprinklings of like history, because like it's in the 1700s that she is born, but it also goes into modern day, and then obviously there's little sprinklings of like fantasy and magical realism with like the devil and like living forever and all that fun stuff. This book has such a strong beginning, which is like impressive, because something that I've found is really big critique for me is when a beginning is like very slow. I find it really difficult for me when a beginning of the book is really slow. So the fact that this had such a strong beginning is amazing, and I think it makes me want to recommend it to more people, because like if you're not someone who reads a lot, having a strong beginning makes it easier for you to read the book. So because it was such a strong beginning, I was hooked instantly and I wasn't confused at all. So props for that. Also, the writing is absolutely beautiful, but not in like a try hard way. Sometimes I find like I'm not really a big like LaRue fiction fan, because I sometimes find that it could be like a little too pretentious, or sometimes when you have really beautiful writing it can get away of the plot for me personally. But I think this just strikes a beautiful balance, so it's like it's beautiful but it still gets the job done of telling the story. And yeah, obviously the book was very sad and left me very emotional, and I think that's a sign of a good book when it can elicit a strong emotional reaction out of someone. Just like if you want to read this, keep in mind I was like emotional like the whole entire day after reading this book. I basically just spent the next day crying. So, you know, like just be smart about when you read this book. You know, maybe read it, try and end it over the weekend. You know, maybe you can take some time off and read it at home, like for a staycation type of read, but like I want to read this at like a beach or something like that. Just keep that in mind. I would really recommend this book because it's beautiful and it's a really well told story. There you go. Okay, and now we have the final Shadow and Bone Groshiverse books, the Six of Crows duology. This is my number 2 book of the year, and honestly I almost gave it number 1, but I'll explain why I didn't give it number 1 at the end of my review of this. If you follow me on TikTok, this probably isn't a surprise. I absolutely love this series. I read this in February and I gave both of them 5 out of 5 stars. It's in the same world as Shadow and Bone, but like in a different part of the world, and I just absolutely love that Bardugo is able to add so many new elements to her existing world already. And the characters in this book are just, they're amazing. I love them so much more than the other ones in the series. I just relate to them. I love how they're all so unique and complex. Nina is like me. Like, I am Nina. I have never read a character that I've related to more in my life, so I think that's also kind of why I love this series. This book is also about a heist, which is like really cool. If you've ever watched like Ocean's 11, like it helped inspire this book, and it was so cool to read. It was just, there's so many like twists and turns. Some of them I expected, but others I just like completely shocked me, which is what I love to read. I love when books surprise me in a good way. And yeah, I just fell in love with the characters. I was crying at the end of Crooked Kingdom, not because it was like sad per se, like there were some sad things, but also I just connected so much to the characters. I like fell in love with them, and like I cry pretty easily. So yeah, I definitely cried a little bit at the end. The only reason why I didn't put this as #1 is that because it is a spin-off series, it kind of has a little bit of a barrier to reading it. It's not like you could technically pick this up and read it independently, but I think having read Shadow and Bone is really useful, because since it's a spin-off series, Bardugo doesn't do as much explanation of the world, so it can be a little bit more confusing, and I think that the story is better if you've read Shadow and Bone. So that's why I didn't put it as #1, because it's a spin-off series. It's a little bit harder for me just to like tell people read this book, but for me personally, I absolutely loved it. That's why it's #2. Okay, and now just as the lighting is starting to go, let's finish this video off with my #1 book of the year. It is The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes. I read this back in March. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And okay, you know the feeling of cuddling up, it's raining outside, you have a cup of tea, you're about to open a nice book. That feeling is this book. That is how I would describe it. It's like a warm hug. It is so comforting. I love it. Funny little story. My mom actually read it first and recommended it to me. She absolutely loved it. We recommended it to my brother's girlfriend, and my mom was joking like, she cannot be a part of this family if she does not love this book. Wow, because me and my mom love this book so much. This is a historical novel. This story is about Alice. She moves from the UK to rural Kentucky, and she starts working for this pack horse library, which is basically a library run by these women who go on horses to rural parts of their county to deliver books to poor and underprivileged families. There's something so special about reading about women who love reading. As a woman who loves reading, like, obviously instantly have a connection with all the characters because I love reading, and you know, they're librarians. They chose to do this job because they love reading. There is some romance in the novel, but it's secondary to all the relationships that the women create amongst themselves. Each of the side characters are so complex, and they add something to the story. It's just so well done in that way. Something I also really like is that Moyes, she does a really good job of like highlighting the beauty, but also being critical at the same time about life in rural South. Yes, the book is slightly predictable, but also that's kind of what makes it nice, because this is like a very nice and easy read. There's no like huge mysteries that you have to like unsolve. It's just a very easy, comfortable read. It's kind of like what you need in such a turbulent year. It's just such a nice soft book like this. If you know anyone who loves reading, especially historical fictions, they need to read this book. I highly recommend it, obviously because it's my #1 book of this year. Ooh, I like how this is a top 10 books and I have 20 books there. I'm also so tired. My throat is sore now from talking so much. Okay, that's it guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know down in the comments what your favorite book is that you read this past year. And with all of my book videos, like, you can clearly see what I like to read. So let me know if you have any recommendations for me in the comments down below. Please like this video if you want to see more book content from me, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on another new video. That is it, guys. I hope you have a great day. Christmas decorations will be gone. Actually, they might still be in the next video, but they'll be gone soon, okay? I'm filming this on New Year's Eve, so I hope everyone had a great New Year's Eve. And hopefully 2022 is going to be a better year. Okay, that's it, guys. Bye.